Well, welcome, and I've got some friends sitting in the room with me as we're going to be talking about emotions and change leadership. And I'm really excited. If you've been able to join us in the recording, you're going to have a great time listening in while I talk to my friends about a reading that we've all done together. A reading by Jill Blackmore called Lost in Translation, Emotional Intelligence, Affective Economies, Leadership and Organisational Change. It was a big reading, lots of big ideas, which is why I've asked my friends along to help me out. I'll introduce them to you. So first of all, Craig, do you want to say good day?
Hey, g'day. I'm Craig Murison. I'm the principal of Mackay Christian College, and it's just delightful to be part of this conversation.
Thank you. Hi, Jeanine.
Hi, Jill. I'm Jeanine Gallagher. I work as a Senior Education Officer in Brisbane Catholic Education.
Thank you for joining us. And Tony.
G'day, folks. No, you're right. There we go. Tony McCormack. I'm Deputy Principal at Lockyer District High in Gatton, and very much looking forward to joining with you guys this afternoon.
And Tony, I think you said it's just started hailing outside. I could hear the thunder before, so you know, if you hear any grumbling, it's not that I've kept you from your dinner. It's really that there is, and some exciting nature happening outside of the conversation. So.
Absolutely, the dog's hiding under a trailer, so it's okay.
Okay. Oh, well, while you're on the screen, Tony, when you read through, I'm wondering if that first question that we thought about. She starts off by saying that emotions really seem to be, in the 21st century, one of these things that we're saying is central to leadership and change. Is that kind of your experience? Did you have any thoughts about that statement?
Absolutely. I think in the current context of leadership, if you're not thinking about how people are feeling and how people are approaching a problem, then you're really well and truly behind the eight ball. As a leader, you need to be constantly cognizant of how your team are going, what you need to be protecting them from above in such a change-heavy world, and what you need to be supporting them to achieve, and how to go about doing that. So if you're not aware of what the emotions are going on and what that emotional capital looks like, then you really can't do your job.
You use the word emotional capital. Do you want to just explain that a little bit, and then I'll flip over and ask Jeanine and Craig what they think.
Sure. I guess my view of emotional capital and what the article was talking about are slightly different tangents. I guess for me, emotional capital is almost like, if you think of it as a bank, that you deposit good emotional capital when you're looking after people and you're doing good things and you're able to say yes a lot. But occasionally you have to say no, and occasionally you have to do things that your team aren't going to be particularly happy with, but it's something that has to happen, or it's in the greater good, and your role as leader is to see that. And so occasionally you have to make a withdrawal from the emotional capital bank, and then it's about building up that goodwill and that good emotional capital again over time in order to keep people working with you. As I was looking through the article, it's sort of a little bit different in places where that concept of collective emotion versus individual emotion sort of confused me a little bit, but it's, yeah, I think the underpinning is certainly there.
I think what you're talking about is often that collective emotion, and it sounds like you're being really conscious and deliberate and aware of how much you're asking and how much it costs emotionally. So yeah, I think you're on that same page. Jeanine, what are your thoughts? Do you think emotions do play a big part in 21st century leadership?
I think yes, they do, and I think it's really hard to quantify and qualify, because it's that state of me knowing who I am and me making a guess as to who you are based on how I know me, if that makes sense. And I think understanding that emotions, and you often hear, we can all have the same experience, and we've walked out of the room, we can all be at the same event and have a totally different experience of that same event. And I think emotions and play a large part of that, and in a leadership role where we're living in and I've written down the words relational and contextual. So it's constantly changing, and it's challenging, and I think we live in a very fluid environment that's got a lot of pressure on people at the moment, and can't see that that's changing. So yes, kind of answered your question, but not.
No, you did, because what I'm hearing is that 21st century work conditions have changed, and that means how we work within those work conditions has changed, which is really important work for a leader. Now, Craig, we've known each other a long time. I can say that you have been a leader in the 20th and 21st century. So can you give me a perspective on, why you think emotions have become more central to leadership? Or have they?
Well, I don't think they've become any more central to leadership. I think they've become more central in the rhetoric around leadership. I think they've become more central in the conversation around leadership. But in reality, they've always been important. They've always been at the centre of what makes a leader a great leader. And I agree with the other two guys in the conversation that I think at the core of it all, there's an issue of self-efficacy that really is at the root of what Goleman writes about, and is, I don't think, disputed by Blackmore in this article. Part of the contention between the two is the definitions of terms, which is what Jeanine was talking about. That Blackmore's taken a particular line on the scientific base for Goleman's arguments, and Goleman has written for a more popularised audience. But that's a bit off your question, Jill, sorry. The reality is I don't think it is any more important, but it's we've become more aware of its importance, and therefore more deliberate about the way we try to address it.
I think one of she's a sociologist and is interested in particularly a critical perspective, and she was talking about a lot of educational leadership rhetoric has often been adopted straight from popular leadership writing without perhaps being problematized.
Yes.
So I'm just wondering, like I was saying to Tony before, Fullan and Hargraves and Goleman, we've all heard about them at workshops for our professional development. And she's saying, actually, just be a bit cautious here. We actually need to problematize. And what do you think she's talking about? And I'm interested whether you think, yes, I agree. Who'd like to go first? Is this burning up inside anyone? Jeanine's smiling. She gets to go first.
I actually thought that was a really interesting wording, problematise it, and I went to go with that whole notion of growth mindset, which is really nice and trendy at the moment, about to solve a problem you actually need to know what the problem is, have a growth mindset around it, and there's a risk of that becoming just jargonistic or jargony, but I like the way she said, I like the idea of problematising it, not because it's then it warrants thinking through, and it warrants consideration and action, active deliberation around it, as opposed to reactive responses. And if you see something problematic, then I'm more likely to try and make the effort to work through the iterations of it to come up with a solution. That's the way I've interpreted it. So I quite like the idea of it being problematised, because then you start thinking about the whole packet of it all, what it all might mean and everything that goes with it. Does that make sense?
It does, and I think you're talking about being a thinking leader who, is critically inquiring the whole time, going, okay, let's think this through. What does this look like? Who doesn't it work for? And I know you've got a particular interest in inclusion, so I guess, who is excluded in this conversation is also one of those questions. that's part of problematizing as well. Craig, what are your thoughts about? I know you've read all of Michael Fullan's books. In fact, I think you were the first one to say, "Here, Jill, read this." What do you think about problematization of those leadership advice writers?
Well, it might be somewhat reassuring to your students to know that I had to look the word up to be sure I actually understood what it meant. And in looking it up, I came across another way of saying what problematization is, and it's to demythicize. So demythicization. So I really like Blackmore's comment, the underlying comment that the risk is we adopt without interrogating. And so she's arguing that educational leaders and educational leadership training is delivering Goleman's or adopted Goleman's ideas on emotional intelligence without interrogating them, which again is what Jeanine was saying about even asking, is there a problem? What is the problem? Does this theory actually address the problem? And what are the myths that come in to accepting a popularized sort of theory? The counterpoint I'd like to make to that is that one of the things about Goleman's writing about emotional intelligence, and he's not the originator of these ideas, he's just put them together in a very popular way. I've probably oversaid that word popular, but anyway, it makes sense. When you've been in leadership any length of time and you read his work, there are a number of sort of aha moments that go with that. You know, you read it and you go, yes, you know, I am that sort of person, and I have this sort of impact on the people I lead when I'm like that. The other thing I like about what she does is she brings up, because it's her bent, the issues of culture, race, and gender, and that what Goleman says is said in a way that applies equally across all those things, and of course it doesn't at all. And that's one of the things that comes out of that when you problematize through that theory. I think as leaders, when we've read that work, you kind of intuitively do that anyway. You intuitively adjust the thinking and apply it appropriately. Now I know Jeanine may well, and you deal with being women, of course. Blackmore is addressing that issue of trying to apply a theory equally across the genders more than any other issue she's looking at. So I confess now before you, I am a male. And that is a male perspective.
You're white too.
Yes, that's exactly right. I'm white.
I'm glad you see that too.
Yes. Yeah, well, I'm glad it's recognisable to you guys as well.
So, I want to build on that thought that not only is she saying let's problematize it for race or gender or culture, but the idea that you as a leader are responsible for managing the emotions of your staff actually kind of diminishes the role of staff as being agents of, can they manage their own emotions? And is it saying that we actually have to sanitize and rationalize emotions? And we've got the AITSL leadership standards sort of sitting there as a nice kind of benchmark for Australian leaders, and saying how we have to be, supportive and intuitive and creative, and putting all of these emotional expectations on leaders without saying, actually, we need to problematize the system. Now, Tony, I don't want you to betray Education Queensland in any way, but there's a real policy push towards independent schools and school leader autonomy, where you've kind of been given, from what I can see, buckets of money and buckets of responsibility, and say, all right, make it work, and if it doesn't work, this comes down to your leadership. So I think, for me, this is Blackmore's kind of saying, hang on, we've actually got to pay attention to the systems and the structures as well. We can't just put it all on the leader. I'm interested in your thoughts, Tony.
I guess specifically around that space, I really liked the way that Blackmore was talking around the importance of the context in which you're trying to educate, and the role that the community you're in plays with the outcomes that you're delivering. Before I moved to this job, I went through a bit of an audit process at my previous school, and one of the big comments that came back out of that was recognising the way that we as a school had educated the community we had and worked with the community we had, not the community we might have wanted to have had. And I think that's really important in what she's saying here about being inclusive and cognizant of what's going on around you and not trying to just pigeonhole things based on the categories that you might want to categorise them as. Some of my notes throughout the article where she's talking about leadership being contingent on others having the same emotional intelligence as the leader, and needing leaders and followers to have the same kinds of emotional intelligence in order to connect, to me wasn't really where my headspace was at, because I think at the end of the day, yes, teachers need to have some agency in what's going on, but it's also the leader's role to be helping to guide and push and steer a course through different things that sometimes the followers and your team don't understand and don't know where they're heading. If I look at my own journey as a young leader, I certainly relied on people around me to help me realise the things that I couldn't see and to manage my emotions for me at times, to help me to learn to manage them myself. And if leaders aren't doing that, then are they really leading?
Yep.
The other thing I'd just like to say in here was really coming back to what Craig was saying before, about this concept needing to be problematised in a way, because emotions have always been important to leadership, and it's been difficult to be a good leader throughout history if you're not looking at these kinds of things. And it's really important that we continue to problematise things so that we're not just drinking the latest Kool-Aid that comes out and subscribing to the latest theory just because it's cool. We have to be aware of why we're doing what we're doing.
I think you've given a really thoughtful set of ideas to think about there, and I like the way that you are using it to reflect on your own practice. And I guess, I want to just shift to Jeanine and then Craig. Was there a thought where you went through and you made some notes and you went, actually, I can see this in my practice, or this doesn't reflect my practice? Because one of the reasons I've asked you is you're all experienced leaders, and I know you're all ethical and good leaders. So was there something in there that you really thought applied to your practice, Jeanine?
I think, in fact, I've highlighted some stuff on page 214. How about that?
Cool.
And it's in and around that contextual and systemic factors that influence teachers' feelings. And I went back to that a few times because I think that teachers' sense of efficacy, and it's the last paragraph, the top of the last paragraph, and how their emotions impact on the work they do. And I guess I work in a fairly emotional space. My day-to-day work is always around, it's emotional, and you're dealing with people's reactions and emotions to the situations that they find themselves in, and having a sense of efficacy around the work. And I guess I come back to, and Blackmore talks earlier about teachers engaging in the teaching practice. Generally, it's relational and it's an emotional commitment. And then we've got this overlay of leadership literature that talks about outcomes and outputs and much more quantifiable things. But most of us actually get into the game of working in education because we are emotionally connected to what we think and what we believe and the values that we subscribe and ascribe to. And we've got all this leadership literature that's requiring us to become much more quantifiable, and that's not a bad thing, but there is a tension there. And depending on the sophistication or the processes that you go through to kind of work that through makes a difference. And as my own leadership journey, I always thought if I was honest and open and worked hard and dedicated and listened to everybody and took all perspectives, that would make me a really good leader. It just made me exhausted. And,
so
and I learned along the way, but I was exhausted. So I needed to work differently, and I needed to be able to work this through and problematize the process for me, and work, and really, and you really do need to have a good sense of yourself, but you also need to be working with people to develop their sense of themselves in that leadership way. It's complex, it's dynamic, it's not linear, it's messy.
Just thinking through where you've identified those conditions for teachers, I think one of the things that the article does well is just open it up and say, okay, you know, teachers have multiple identities, that structures can position teachers and leaders in certain ways, and we do need to be thinking about, well, what power relationships are represented here, and be respectful of the fact that it is exhausting work. And is it your job as a leader to carry everybody's emotions, or is it sometimes your job to get cranky back and say, well, hang on, what's going on here, and is there a system that actually needs changing because this isn't sustainable? So I think it is nice that she's opening it up. Craig, I know you've been thinking about this. How did this apply to your practice?
The thing that challenged me most in reading through the article was really probably the gender aspect to it. There's a couple of quotes from page 217 on where, and she's often quoting others when she's saying these things, but cultural, racial, and gender expectations and stereotypes shape how leadership and emotions are understood and enacted as social practices, arise from and are shaped by gendered social cultural disorders. Now that's from Connell, The Men and the Boys. And she goes on the next page and says, within the educational literature, there is evidence of how women have often felt their emotions pathologized as private, and women's emotionality being used as a rationale for their exclusion from decision making. And then just a little bit further down, there's this very interesting statement that's attributed to Blackmore and Bowler, as there is a politics of emotion in education. Now, I find myself, when I read that, self-reflecting on those gender issues in leadership, and on how I come at managing staff or leading staff. I would say that my intuitive response is not to actually consider gender as an issue at all. And I hear Blackmore in problematizing what Goleman is saying is we actually probably need to do that a little bit more in leadership. I need to be a bit more conscious. So I'm challenged by that. I really got challenged by Bowler's notion of pedagogies of discomfort. I really like that idea, that and that's about the power relationships, you know, the way those power relationships, and trying to be more conscious of the impact that position has on when we speak to people. You know, that me saying something in my job, somebody else can say exactly the same thing in the organisation in a different position, and it have a completely different impact on the people they're speaking to than if I say it. And yet, if I'm not conscious of that, I can leave people with wrong perceptions about directions I'm taking or decisions I'm making, and be completely ignorant of the fact that I'm doing that. So I also thought she was a bit cynical. You know, she addresses the whole emotional intelligence thing as almost like a strategy. On page 210, she says, finding another untapped dimension which can facilitate leaders to do things faster and better through educational management is promising ground to nurture and mine. And it goes on to then use as evidence of that Goleman talks about how these days in leadership we're actually being judged as equally on how well we handle ourselves and each other, and we are about results or productivity or any of those other measures that might be of leadership. And I find that quite a cynical view on it right at the start there.
Okay, well, you do realise that as academics we get paid to be cynical.
Yes.
And I think she picks it up again on page 220, that because emotional intelligence has become part of the ruling discourse, the ruling texts, Jeanine, yeah, as Jeanine would remind me, you know, AITSL are now saying this is what we expect, and, you know, you've got your performance planning and review is going to be around the 360 review. What do my followers think of me? Are they happy with how I'm leading them? That in halfway down page 220, but by using neuroscience to tap in, you know, this is the part of the brain that lights up, and if you're emotionally intelligent, it actually releases people's endorphins, so they're more creative, so they can be more productive. And that fast capitalism, the idea that it's a little bit, it could be a little bit exploitative if you're saying leaders actually need to kind of manage emotions so we can get better results and be first in the market. If that's all emotional intelligence is, then we've got to be really wary. I do think she finishes off by saying that we actually shouldn't be afraid of being angry, and there's a really nice quote that maybe page 223, with this deeper emotion and that ethical tension about being good by complying and doing good for colleagues and students, because as school leaders we have opportunity to be critical and to challenge and to speak back to other kinds of power that might be impacting. Or something I know you're good at, Craig, is narrating identity. Oh, that was dramatic. That was well timed, Thunder. You're into that important moment. Well, I'm interested in your thoughts, and I guess it's that last question that I asked you. Can you think of examples or share a story where you think either you've had that tension or had an opportunity to do good for colleagues in your role as leaders? I know I kind of didn't prepare you for that big question, but I'm interested in your thoughts, that tension between being good and doing good.
That was one of the things that really resonated for me, was that tension between being good and doing good, that the notion of what is the greater good. And I guess it comes back to that emotional capital analogy with the bank before, that sometimes you have to not do good for colleagues in order to do good or be good corporately. But that very rarely makes you feel good when you do it as a leader, and sometimes it's the big call that you paid the big bucks to make. But deep down, it's about trying to do the most good for the most number of people at any given time. You can never quite please everybody all of the time, unfortunately, and consensus and consultation sometimes have to be two very different things. But where leadership, where the rubber really hits the road of leadership, I think, is in that concept of walking that balance and trying to make the right call at the right time in the right time frame, which makes it such a difficult job, I guess.
I think that you're right, it is difficult, and you're reminding me on page 216 we offered the emotional intelligence is only talking about the positive stuff, and there's only hints of the downsides and dark underbelly of leadership work. That's why the thunder was such, you know, a good accompaniment.
Yes.
You're talking about some of that, you know, it is ethical work being a leader and that tension. Thank you, Tony. That was a really moving reflection. Jeanine or Craig, would you like to take up where Tony left off?
On page 216, I actually highlighted some key things in there, and I actually want to flip back then to the other page. It talks about, and I was intrigued around the emotional intelligence literature, where she says leaders and teachers are not positioned as agents of change. And I kind of went, oh, and I really went away and thought about that. What did that really mean, and what is that particularly in this context. And then later in the paragraph, she talks about inquiry, professional knowledge exchange, and relationships of trust and professional efficacy. Kind of went, oh, okay, so there's a whole heap of competing ideas there for me. So then I flip over to page 224, and I think there's a nice summing up of that, and it's around being good versus doing good, that kind of conversation. And it's the complexity of the context. And I think what I've picked up out of it, the theme through this, is that emotions are complex, organisational change is complex, and it's all very relational, and it's hard to quantify and qualify because it's the context from which each relationship or each interaction is coming from. So even today, the four of us having this conversation, we've all read the same article. We've all reacted in different ways to it. We've all come to this discussion with a very different experiences as teachers, different experiences as leaders, and we're in different phases of our leadership journey. And so we're looking at this same article very differently, and it's contextual, and we can have similar ideas. And I think for me that just highlights the very difficult work that a leader has in a school of a staff of 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 people, and that just is magnified compared to what we're trying to unpack. And I think it's hard work, and it's hard thinking work, and having an understanding of that. And it talks about deep emotions and challenging personal and professional identities. And there's nothing like a bad day at work in the office when you go, holy dooly, what have I done today? And you've got really, did I do good or was I good? Actually, sometimes I don't think I did either. I didn't do good, and I wasn't very good either, and I was really bad at it. And those are really challenging, because that really challenges the core of the reason why you got into this work, and the way your day progresses. And as leaders, you have those days, and they're always, in my experience, and others might have different, but they're always highly charged emotional events, always. And, you know, I would like everyone to think that I come into this work every day with, I'm here to do good and be good. But that's not how it always pans out.
And I think what the message I took away was, you have permission to stamp your feet and get angry or get sad and feel challenged and make some of that meaning making visible, but obviously you choose who you make it visible to, because emotions, she talks about it, it's political work as well as moral work. And thank you for thinking out loud like that, Jeanine, because I think it's really reassuring. I think that's why leadership is such an engaging topic to talk about and think about. In a lot of my research, we've been speaking about the importance of professional conversations like this as a way of helping people make meaning and kind of narrate that sense of identity. So I'm listening to you going, yeah, that helps me position myself in my work. So thank you for thinking out loud. Your turn to think out loud.
Oh, I'd probably just neatly pick up off the end of Jeanine's sharing, because I really concur with that. My experience of what I hope has been growth in the area of emotional intelligence in myself, in leadership, is that most of my growth has occurred because of mistakes. Most of my growth has occurred when I've looked back at how I've handled a person and realised I've done the opposite of good, whether I've been well-intentioned or not. And in leadership, in my leadership, what's been significantly important is to have been able to cultivate a few critical friends who are prepared to take me aside and say, do you realise the impact of what you did or what you said? You know, it's John Dewey, I think, who said, you really don't learn anything from experience. You actually only learn when you reflect on your experience. And sometimes as leaders, we actually need help from people to prompt us to reflect on our experience. And in that reflecting, if we are, as Jeanine has been, prepared to be transparent and honest with ourselves, because I think being honest with yourself, you're the hardest person to be honest with is yourself, really, I think. and to allow other people into our lives who we give permission to be honest with us and have that dialogue with. That is so useful in reflecting on that experience and growing through it. The other thing I'd like to add to what Jeanine said is that the reality is we can say we have values and we live by values, but in my experience, all values are actually aspirational statements. We say we value honesty and we try to be honest, but we don't necessarily always live up to that value. We aspire to that value. And I think emotional intelligence is something like that as well. We, as Jeanine is saying, we aspire to be good and do good. And we need to give ourselves permission to be human and to let people down from time to time. And that harks back to Tony's earlier comment about emotional capital or social capital, that if you're building your emotional capital with your team, then a withdrawal has less of an impact, is less difficult to make back up than if you're making withdrawals all the time.
You can't live in deficit.
No, you can't. No, that's absolutely true. You can't.
Well, thank you for a very enjoyable conversation. I'm going to wrap it up now, but it might be that you have just changed the world for someone listening to the recording where they're going, I thought I was the only one who thought like that, or I've never considered that before. And what I'm hearing as I've been listening to the way that you're thinking is that you guys have got stacks of emotional intelligence, that you are good at problematizing, and I think you represent what I'm putting forward to the leadership learners in the learning that I'm designing, is that you're a learning leader who never stops learning. So I want to say thank you very much for being part of this conversation today, and I hope we get to do this again. That'll be really cool. So I'll say goodbye and we'll finish off there.
Thanks, Jill.